Hello and welcome to the BioProcess Insider State of the Industry discussion, and this time it is live from Bio in San Diego. This panel is an opportunity to dig into some of the recent news and trends in the biomanufacturing sector over the past quarter or so, and a chance to look ahead to the second half of the year. I'm the host of this discussion, Dan Stanton, and I am delighted to be joined by a panel of experts in the biopharma and CDMO space. So let's very quickly begin by going down the line, and in 30 seconds or so, let's do a quick introduction, introduce yourself and your company, and then we'll begin the panel. So we'll start with Ninette.
I guess ladies first. Ninette Van Lingen. I'm the Senior Vice President in Business Development with Just Evotech Biologics. We are a provider of services and are part of the Evotech organization.
Sundar?
All right. My name is Sundar Ramanan. I lead the quality organization for Enzene. We are a CDMO company with the only fully connected commercial continuous manufacturing for biologics as a CDMO in the world currently. That is currently in patients. Nice to meet you.
Fantastic. And Brad?
So my name is Brad Stewart. I'm the National Leader for Life Sciences for BDO, and a lot of the work we do is in our BioProcess technology group, looking at CMC manufacturing, both in and outsourced.
Excellent. Well, look, we're going to begin by discussing the post-COVID recovery process. It was over 4 years. Is there a horrible echo? Sorry. Or is it just on our end? Okay, I think we're just getting feedback. Anyhow, it was over 4 years ago then when the world went into lockdown and the biopharma world was put into the spotlight. Vendors and CDMOs in particular saw sudden spikes in demand as we raced to get vaccines and therapies to the public. But what comes up tends to have to come down, and we've seen, 18 months or so of what is described by a lot of communications folks as a post-pandemic normalization, but could also be seen as dramatically decreased demand, the late fruition of capacity build-outs and, general decline. Brad, is that a fair assessment of where we sit as an industry right now?
It is fair. I think some people, depending on where you're at in the industry, might call it apoplectic, but it's really, I think, predictable. So those of us who've been in this industry for a long time, you see these cycles of boom and bust, and that's really a challenge generally with the life sciences industry. Most of the time driven by funding availability. Those of us I was running a company in 2008, and literally capital went away overnight. And we've seen something similar here. Prior to the pandemic, funding levels were very high. During the pandemic, they became abnormally high. And since then, really a drop back to some form of normal. I don't know what that is. But I think the good news is, one, obviously because of the pandemic, you saw a lot of investment in manufacturing. A lot of that capacity that was built in probably won't be used. You've seen the massive decrease in COVID vaccine utilization subsequent to that time. And I think the other thing that's interesting is we're finally starting to see, and it was really at JP Morgan this year, you could start to see the market change back to the customers, the CDMO industry getting funding. And so that's really starting to have a positive impact now. Now it takes a little while to flow through the system, but you can already start to see the changes from that.
Ninette, I see your head nodding up and down in agreement there. Is that your experience at Evotech?
Absolutely, and I think that the normalization that occurred post-COVID is now freeing up. So the venture capital, the seed money is starting to loosen up. I do think people are a bit more prescriptive in terms of what they're going after, and there's not this kind of throwing everything at the wall. I think there's a lot more focus on specific therapeutic indications and really streamlined therapies, which is actually a really nice approach for as we're coming out of COVID.
Sundar, Indian drug makers, did we see a sort of was there a sort of similar trajectory post-COVID? Very often, we're in bio, very US focused. We kind of look a bit insularly. We don't look at the Indian market. But was there a similar sort of story going on over the past couple of years at Indian CDMOs?
So for the most part, the overall trends are common, right? So during the COVID time, money was cheap. So the cheap money flowed through the system. So ideas that should otherwise would not have been funded, got funded. And those inefficiencies are now removed from the system, I would say, with the higher interest rates. And the overall trends are similar. And in supply chain also, things are starting to normalize. Except for some of the raw materials that are rare and unique and rarely used. But overall, the trends are getting to, I would say, a new normal, not the normal back. Because, we are accelerating more molecules through the pipeline than prior to COVID at a faster pace as well. So it's a new normal, but it's a normal. Yeah.
Bob, I'm going to pick up on something, Brad, sorry. It's been a long day. I'm going to pick up on something you mentioned. You said the sort of ups and downs are predictable. They should be forecasted in. But why does this industry often get it so wrong? We've seen jobs come, we've seen jobs go. Is that just the nature of demand? Or because it feels to me, as someone who is a journalist and not a scientist and not a businessman, that we do get it wrong a lot of the time.
I don't know that we get it wrong. I think the market's not designed for products like this. And I've tried to explain to people, I've spent most of my career as a CEO of startup companies, and I've tried to explain to friends of mine what I do and what that means, and trying to explain to them that I have to run a company for 15 years, only spending money and generating no revenue, doesn't resonate with most people. They can't understand what that's like. And so I think part of the challenge is, we end up being in a marketplace. First of all, we assume and I'm talking about the investment market, we assume it's rational, which is your first mistake, right? That's absolutely not true. It's a group of human beings making decisions that they convince themselves are based on some rational thought. So we see this in other industries. You see it in the tech industry. Remember the internet bubble and burst. You see it in AI today, electric vehicles a couple of years ago. So these things become very cyclical. I think one of the challenges we face in the biotechnology industry is those timelines are so much longer, and frequently we're competing against capital. It's not uncommon to have life sciences investors who also invest in technology. So how can you ever justify that investment in a 15-year, 10-year development program when your partner is investing in Google 15 years ago? So that creates challenges, but then the same thing when during the COVID pandemic, people are going to be making billions of dollars forever on COVID vaccines. And so it's just, these things become trends that drive things more than that. Not to make this answer too long, but I was going to say earlier, if we could predict things, we'd all be rich, right?
Rich and happy.
If you were building capacity in 2018, 2019, you'd build a mRNA vaccine production facility. If you were doing that in 2020, let's say 3, you would probably be scaling those down and starting to build out ADC facilities, but we just don't know what the next thing is going to be at that next moment. So,
well, let's talk about capacity, because both Ninette and Sundar, your relative companies have invested in capacity. You're building, Just Evotech has its facility in the US, it has one in France, which is opening soon. And then over at Enzene, we've got the New Jersey facility. How important is it, especially on the back of the rhetoric that we were hearing during the pandemic of local or more localized manufacturing, to have these sort of sites and this capacity in these different locations?
Well, I think, look, global access to medications is always going to, in my naive world, it would always be the driver of how you make these decisions. The truth of the matter is we chose in the middle of COVID to invest in our Toulouse, France. And it's a pod configuration. It went up in approximately 19 months for continuous manufacturing for monoclonal antibodies. And we are in it to bring therapeutic medications to save lives at a lower cost around the world. So it depends on what companies' missions are in terms of how they're going to drive, but if you play for the long game, I think you hit the nail on the head. If we could predict what's going to happen when a medication hits phase 3, none of us would be up here. But it's managing that time period quickly, phase 1, phase 2, make the decision points to move forward or step back. And I think that we're poised as an organization to bring that flexibility to organizations to allow them to make that decision faster.
Sundar?
So in terms of capacity, right, we see a huge demand. And I'll tell you where the demand comes from. As an innovative and technology-focused company, you don't need $1 billion to make a biologic manufacturing plant. And we started in India, right? And we created a fully connected continuous manufacturing, and we have several products in the market to serve Indian patients. So the market access portion, so a large portion of biologic products, as biosimilars, are still not accessible to a large portion of the global patient population. So that population, which is a huge unmet medical need, we were the first one to bring the value of technology in lowering the cost and transferring that value to patients directly to Indian patients, right? So now what we are going to do is to scale that and bring that technology to US, so where we will be transferring that value and democratize the technology, right, which is fully validated, and to the US patients as well, so that we want to transform. We see a very healthy demand for both increasing the number of products for monoclonal antibodies to begin with in the modality, as well as the new patients that we'll be serving who would otherwise not be served.
So it's very much now about market access, the different models in different regions.
That's right.
Yeah, whereas maybe, perhaps, and correct me if I'm misspeaking, but in the past it was very much seen as we're going to have a centralized hub for manufacturing and we're going to ship all over the world.
Exactly. So what the way these plants are designed is you don't need multi-billion dollars. You don't need multiple years. We can put these facilities really fast. They are by design serving the modern needs of data integrity as well as contamination control that the regulators expect. So we are able to bring the value of the technology and an intensification to the patients much faster. That's right. So we'll be closer to the patients globally.
I want to move from sort of that market access and that the sort of rhetoric that was being spoken during the pandemic of sort of ensuring and advance on that a little bit. I think we need to talk about the BioSecure Act. It's obviously, I see Nanette has rolled her eyes. Yeah, well, this is it. I mean, it's definitely, from what I'm hearing, the biggest story in the CDMO in the supply chain space this year. To me, it's this kind of strange mix of politics and patriotism, and could be a real threat to that supply chain. Brad, do you want to start and tell us what's going on, and then we'll move on?
I think you just described the United States, a strange mix of politics and patriotism. So thank you for that. But it is a challenge. During the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about onshoring, nearshoring, and that was more of a supply chain risk, right? We clearly saw the challenges we faced of getting almost anything from APIs just to bags or tubing or anything you might need for facilities. I think no matter how much you push on that, that's not the world we live in, and it's not the world we've lived in for a very long time, right? And these global supply chains really are global for everyone, right? And there are specific places that have the technology necessary to make those raw materials or other things that we utilize, and they're just never going to be onshored to this country or every other country, right? So, and we see this even when you get through manufacturing. It's not uncommon that people have a fill-finish facility on another continent, right? So these are very expensive facilities. They're obviously licensed. They've gone through tons of validation. They're highly trained people, and it's illogical to say, I'm going to make a drug and fill-finish it in 19 different countries, right? And so I think there's just some natural part of this that creates challenges, right? So if you look at the BioSecure Act and saying, well, now we're going to, and I won't get into the politics and everything else, but it creates really significant challenges to our supply chains. One of the things, maybe we'll talk about it later, is after this sort of decrease in fundings, it's also challenging for companies to start to feel safe enough to make decisions to scale up programs again, right? even if they have the money, they're sort of more nervous about making those investments. But if you're already, working with a CDMO somewhere in the world, your processes are set up, you've done all the tech transfer, you're actually producing clinical supply or whatever it may be, that is a dramatic change that is difficult on your business. It consumes a stunning amount of resources and time to try and move that production to other places. So at least in the last month, Congress has sort of, I think, heard feedback from the industry to say, well, if we don't comment on the politics, you at least need to understand that this isn't something that happens overnight, right? So I think they're up to about 7.5 years now people would have to transition out.
I think 2032 was the last
2032.
I heard, if that's going. Ninette, you were saying that you've been privy to a few conversations about this.
Well, even some of the conversations today, I just think that we have a major education of policymakers that needs to take place. And pharma as general of late has a negative positioning. And so it's incumbent upon us to really locally talk with our policymakers and kind of build on that so that maybe when 2032 rolls around, things will have adjusted to more of a common sense approach to managing what we need to manage on a global basis and less of what's happening right now, which is the political slant to an issue that's real, but the solution isn't necessarily what came out of it.
But while things are changing, the 2032 sort of concept now, it still looks like it's going ahead. So with that, from Just Evotec's perspective and from a business perspective, are you hearing customers coming to you looking for demand, looking for capacity, suddenly panicking, or?
I don't know that there's a panic, but I think that, as Sundar said, there is a need for capacity around the globe. The good news, what is stimulating that is people are actively pursuing multiple modalities, therapies, and cures for medicines. I think that over the next 3 years, we'll see a balancing out of where that ends up, but right now we're not really concerned. Geopolitically, there are some things driving kind of an influx right now, but again, play the long game and not respond to the trends, and I think we'll continue to build capacity to fit the needs for the market.
It's too easy for just to imagine customers kind of diving from one side to the other in a fit fabric. There's no one-size-fits-all solution for people.
No, there's not. There never is.
But I'm a very basic person, so I always try to find sort of the basic trends that are coming through this. And I'm wondering, Sundar, from an Indian CDMO perspective, with China potentially, Chinese CDMOs potentially being frozen out of the market, is this where Indian drug manufacturing comes in and fills a gap?
Look, industrial policy is part of life, right? They come and go. So I'm not going to get into the Biosecure Act at all from that perspective, because we are purely focused on patients. At the end of the day, we are going to stay focused on patients. And regardless of, at the end of the day, all CDMOs are focused on patients. Okay? So these things ebb and flow. From our perspective, our priority is, there are twofold. One is, how do we accelerate product to the market, number one? How do we serve the patient need for bringing access to these complex medication to patients in need? And how do we bring the fruits of technology to the US? Right, that's where we are purely focused on. So our strategy is very simple. Just keep a patient at the center of everything, and then everything else will evolve around it. That's one way to go about it. The second thing that we think about in terms of geographic scale out is talent, right? If you look at the demography globally, we need the kind of skill set that we need is very different from 15, 20 years back for people making biologics. You can have a high school student making biologics. Today, the facility is a much smaller footprint. You need engineers to run the automation. So it's a very different skill set. So our focus is squarely on patients. how to build geographically, globally, right? After US, we want to go to different places. That's where we are focused on, right? So, and we
then the
see a
talent.
huge demand, right? So, yeah, that's where our focus is: patients, technology.
Okay, and we won't go political right now as well, so unless you want to.
No, I'm not. I'm bypassing. Well, the great thing about continuous manufacturing is the footprint is small and your yield is big. So what would normally take a 2,000 liter or a 20,000 liter scale up in continuous manufacturing, you're able to do with an adjustment of days and a much smaller footprint. So you start harvesting at 8 days, you start harvesting at 15 days, you can generate 35 to 40 grams within a 30-day period. That's a significantly turning of the industry standards away from batch manufacturing. So those are the things that I think are going to come up and out of this political disarray right now.
So really these new technologies
It's
are
a
going to burst
technology
through.
drive.
Brad, are you seeing sort of similar things from the people you speak to on your side, that things like continuous manufacturing can kind of not produce a quick fix to some of these problems we're seeing, but allow sort of speedier access and smaller footprints and more flexibility, I suppose?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things. I'm glad Sundar mentioned something. I mean, talent is always the biggest challenge, and you could close off any country in the United States, and you're not going to have the talent here to do that work, right? I mean, that's just ultimately a huge challenge. Forget the facilities, right? You just don't have the talent to run it. So certainly there are a lot of things you see. I mean, the switch over to disposable systems, single-use systems over the past 10, 15 years has been dramatic. The scaling down of bioreactor sizes has been dramatic. The yields going up has been dramatic. So I think you're seeing so many process improvements that are having a big impact on these. The other thing, we work in an industry that's so averse to change, and a regulatory agency that's so averse to change. A lot of these changes are being driven because they're new product modalities, right? The new cell therapies and gene therapies that sort of weren't encumbered by the past way of manufacturing things, that I think creates a pretty unique opportunity at a point in time to start moving some of these platforms into new processes, which maybe the FDA is more ready to accept as a result of that.
I'm loving how this conversation is talking about the Biosecure Act, and we've gone from that to actually how process intensification platforms sort of feed into that same narrative. It's the whole world is intertwined, and whereas it's not just about increasing yield and increasing titers anymore, it's about also sort of placing these technologies within an ever-changing world, politically and economically. Therefore, I'm hoping we're going to get a similar sort of result on the next topic, because the other, I think, major news story that has hit the services side, the CDMO side particularly, is the potential acquisition of Catalent by Novo Holdings and the subsequent sale of those fill-finish plants. So, Brad, it's fair to say this is driven by GLP-1s, what I kind of want to call the Wegovy wave.
Yeah.
What sort of effect is this demand for GLP-1s starting to change the industry, or is the Catalent acquisition the first stage of major eruptions to occur? Or
I don't know that it's the first stage of major acquisitions, because it's certainly a part of major investments, right? And if you see that. I mentioned earlier, if you knew the future, right, you probably would have been building ADCs and maybe facilities to fill finish GLP-1s and that sort of thing. We can't always predict these things. Hopefully people build facilities that are flexible, and they have the ability to update and adapt those as the opportunities come along. It's all of the companies that are in the GLP-1 race, not just companies with commercial products, because everyone wants to be in the market somehow. So Novo Nordisk, obviously, none of these companies can keep up with demand on a local or international level. So anything they can do to increase capacity, this is one of those rare circumstances where it's literally billions of dollars of revenue just lost. They're lost opportunities. And so the amount of investment is almost meaningless, right? I mean, it's not free money, but you're literally trading that production capacity for immediate sales. So, obviously Novo Nordisk's approach of thinking about or intending to acquire Catalent. You've seen Lilly invest, I think they're up to $5 billion now and expanding and building new production facilities. So I think people are going to look at any way possible to be able to expand
we've seen
production.
We've seen those in-house investments in the drug substance side, but I guess on the fill finish, it's so far anyway, it's been very much sort of companies have been eyeing up acquisitions and such. Sorry, Sundar, you've grabbed the mic. Do you want to talk about the GLP-1 side, the peptide side, and what influence, if anything, it's having on your strategy or generally?
So if you were to look at the overall, take a step back, right? So in terms of capacity is both chronic need as well as an acute need. And when you have a new molecule or a company that has an acute need, they address it by a multitude of forces, right? So when you deploy capital, it's going to yield results in a certain amount of time, 2 to 3 years to build a new facility. So companies may choose to do that space or choose to acquire capacity. Now I'll go to why moving to a new technology such as continuous manufacturing is really helpful. If you're in the continuous manufacturing space, all you need to do to scale up is scale time, scale out. So from a 15-day process, you go to a 60-day process, you can make a lot more, right? So that's where bringing new technology into place, where the demands are going to be in a fungible capacity need, both chronic and acute. Technology can address that. Right, so adapting and moving to continuous manufacturing and fully connected continuous manufacturing can address those needs when you need it. You only need to produce it for 15 days. When you don't need it, or when you need it, you produce for 50 days. When you don't need it, you produce for 15 days. So you triple the capacity pretty fast with technology.
So again, despite the the macroeconomic, the focus on these types of modalities, it's still all about the technologies that are going to be the flexible and able to feed this demand as it occurs.
That is right. Yeah.
And I'll add, I mean, certainly fill finish is a massive shortfall right now. I mean, again, an injectable drug is not what people were projecting, that sort of demand or the timing of it. So that creates a lot of challenges. You see the impact it has further along in the research and development pipeline now. So now the holy grail is an oral GLP-1, right? And so then you maybe what happens before Novo Nordisk acquires enough capacity to manufacture and fill finish the injectable drug, somebody has an oral drug to compete with it. And then you think, well, I've just spent billions of dollars to compete in a market that doesn't exist anymore. So it's a challenge.
Nanette, I know Just Evotech doesn't play directly in the sort of peptide space, but is this an area which is either ringing bells or getting management to focus on as these sorts of deals take place?
We don't really, we're really focused in the biologic monoclonal antibody space. I mean, this is a boon for the organizations that have made the investments in this classification of drug, and they're going for, I think the question is the ramification of the buyout of CDMOs for the perspective of how are we going to honor contracts in the future. I think it puts the onus on us when we're negotiating with big pharmas, because really it's the people, the companies that Catalent will have to disengage with. That's where we can kind of step in and rebuild. But it's changing the landscape. Change is scary, but we could use a little change in how we
change is scary, but it does offer opportunities.
Absolutely, absolutely.
We are time is catching up on us very quickly, so I would like to shift gears and look at the next few months. Again, I don't want to go political because I'm in the US and I was told you should never talk about religion or politics. However, there is going to be an election here in November, big size. I don't want to talk about the result or anything. Well, no, I do want to talk about the result. What does this mean for the CDMO space? You know, we've seen with ERA, with IRA, policy being introduced from a biotech, biopharma side of things, but what could one result, one way or the other, mean for our industry? And it's a very broad question because we don't really know, but what are your thoughts?
I go first. Yeah, so I didn't realize there was an election coming up, but thanks for letting me know. It's a very unusual situation, I think, this time, because there's usually some sort of polar shift in how you expect either candidate might react towards our industry, but in this case, they both are fairly similar in their approach, right? Both Trump and Biden have been very supportive of drug price controls, which were enacted in the Inflation Reduction Act. I don't see that changing. They both have suggested those will continue. I do think, regardless of who gets elected, there'll be changes in the IRA to address the difference between small molecule and large molecule exclusivity to align those, because we're already seeing the downstream negative effects of that and people moving away from oral drug development, particularly in oncology. They both, I'm not sure which administration has had more rhetoric against China, to be honest. But they certainly both have, so I'm not sure that I really see too many changes there. I think, though, the Biden administration has been less likely to act unilaterally. So I think, if anything, that's probably where there's more of a potential change. The Biden administration has been a little bit more process-oriented, and they tend to, even the Biosecure Act, we were talking about before, there's been some adjustments to it over the last few months that have at least made it something that companies could deal with and still be able to manufacture products. I think the Trump administration and his previous administration, I don't think that consideration process would have happened. A lot of those decisions tended to just be made, and then the downstream consequences are what they are. So,
I suppose also we had COVID during the last Trump administration, which skewed sort of things from a political perspective. Ninette, what are your thoughts here?
I'm just going to go back and state what I restate what I stated earlier. Is we have a responsibility to educate our policymakers on the ramifications of the IRA Act in terms of what's the impact long term for R&D, what's the impact for technology and development, because there are short-term goals that they're shooting for, but there's a lack of understanding the long-term ramifications of those decisions, because they're kind of using the political play on everybody's wallet, right? People are concerned. I can have a conversation about reimbursements and those types of things, but people aren't really peeling back the onion and having the real discussion about what will happen 10 years from now because of the change in the research and development tied to all of that. And I think we need to have those conversations.
And finally, Sundar, your thoughts?
So in terms of industrial policy, like I mentioned, right, so we should be mindful about confusing causation and correlation. So let's take Obamacare, Affordable Care Act in 2009, right, which enabled biosimilars to come into the marketplace. So there's also an open time and a space. So each policy takes some time to go through the system and make meaningful changes. So, yes, you make legislative pathways in X amount of time. I don't see it impacting immediately to any industry because it takes time, and the free market enterprise system that we have in the US allows for things to work itself out. Yeah.
Well, look, I think we could carry on talking for a good another hour just on the political issues itself, but we are out of time. So with that, I would just like to thank the panelists, Ninette Van Lingen, Sundar Ramanan, and Brad Stewart for joining me today. And obviously, if there are any questions for the panel, let's take it off the stage. I'm sure they'll be delighted to talk to you and talk about their political affiliations. Or not. Thank you.